Yeah, I'd be glad to do that, Stephanie. And the great thing about your audience, your audience is so smart. We don't have to go over every twist and turn of international monetary policy over the last 50 years. We could, but we're not gonna do that. I think people know the outline. Yeah, it's really what's coming. That's the main event. Um, so a couple of things. We should probably, without taking too much for granted, we should probably just define BRICS. It's an acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So those are the BRICS. And started in 2002 as a Goldman Sachs marketing gimmick. Jim O'Neill and some partners came up with it, and all they did, I'm not diminishing what they did, but they kind of took the leading economies, took out the G7 and Switzerland and a couple of obvious leaders, and said, well, who's left? That will be the up and comers, the fastest growing developing economies. Then they got Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That was kind of easy. And then a few years later, they added South Africa, which was a little bit of a favor to South Africa. South Africa is not anywhere near as large as those other economies or as important. However, it is one of the biggest economies in Africa. And if you're going to be the BRICS, you can't just be South America and Asia. You probably need to include an African country. So they picked South Africa. So that's how it evolved. So for a couple of years, it was a Goldman marketing brochure. But then in 2006, at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, annual meeting, and it's famous, heads of state and foreign ministers show up from all over the world, but they have what they call these bilateral meetings on the sidelines. And sometimes with three or four, say, hey, we're all here, let's just grab a conference room and sit down and talk. Well, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, this was Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president at the time. Of course, Putin is president today. Hu Jintao, before Xi Jinping, and the prime minister of Brazil, who actually was Lula da Silva at the end. He got arrested later, went to jail, got out, and now he's back. And the prime minister of India. So they sat down. And they said, yeah, we actually have a lot in common, a lot to talk about, and we added it up. We're a pretty powerful group. So they formalized it. And then in 2009, they had a summit conference, a formal summit conference with an agenda and all that in Yekaterinburg in Russia, in the Russian Federation. And for those who know their Russian history, that's the place where the Bolsheviks killed the Tsar and his ministers and the Romanov family. But I guess the Russians have a little bit of a sense of humor. But anyway, that's where they had this summit, and they solidified, okay, we're a group, we're going to work together, and they did. And over the coming years, they multiplied numerous subgroups. People say it's the BRICS meeting coming up August 22nd. Well, yeah, that's the leaders summit. They have about 190 meetings a year. They have working groups on women's rights, sports, the environment, climate change. You could go on and on. It's a very active, what they call secretariat, which is central organization. A few years later, in 2014. They formed what they call the New Development Bank, NDB. Well, what's the New Development Bank? They, first of all, it's got $100 billion of capital, part paid in, part callable, but it also has borrowing power with that kind of ownership and that kind of capital on the balance sheet. They've got hundreds of billions of dollars of borrowing power. They could easily get a pretty good credit rating. And the purpose is to make loans for development projects to the member countries. And by the way, there are stockholders of the New Development Bank who are not BRICS, but they're kind of in the club. Well, what does that sound like? Multilateral? Well, it's the World Bank. That's exactly right. The World Bank on their own terms with their own governance. Okay, the following year, they created something called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. Well, what's that? Again, they threw in a couple $100 billion from the members. China was the biggest contributor. Again, with borrowing power, so take a couple $100 billion times 5 or 10, that's your power. And this institution was designed to be a swing lender to members who were running trade deficits or facing a run on their currency or facing the prospect of having to close the capital account. Exactly what we saw in 1997, 98, by the way. I was there for that one. We ended up with long-term capital. But a pool that is a swing lender to countries with balance of payments deficit. What does that sound like? That's the IMF. That's the IMF. So basically, they copy the World Bank. They copied the IMF. And I want to make 2 points. Number one, it's not like the BRICS popped up 6 months ago and said, hey, we're going to have a new currency. It's like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland putting on a play. This has been in the works for 17 years. And it's typical Russian, Chinese. They kind of run a show, very methodical. So they duplicated the World Bank. They duplicated the IMF. Now they have applicants for membership, and there are, I think, 21 or more countries who have applied. Well, 7 have formally applied for membership. They filled out their college essay and they want to be members. And then another 13 or 14 on the waiting list, so to speak, and will perhaps eventually become members. But when you add those in, some of these will be admitted in August 22nd. That's the next big meeting, starting with Saudi Arabia. Okay, so what happens when you let Saudi Arabia into the BRICS, given the other members? You have 2 of the 3 largest oil producers in the world, Russia and Saudi Arabia. You have 2 of the 3 largest nuclear arsenals in the world, Russia and China. You have, throwing India in and some others, you have about 50% of global population, 54% of global GDP using purchasing power parity. You can debate the method, but just if you do purchasing power parity, you get over half of GDP, 30% of the global landmass. I could go on and on. My point is I learned development economics in the 1970s. We had something called the third world. It was Russia or Soviet Union and the US, and then there was the third world, and all you knew about them was they were poor, and you had to get them off the runway. We actually had the runway theory of how you grow. Turned out to be wrong, but that's what we learned. Well, this is not the old third world. These are not basket cases. These are many of the biggest economies in the world that collectively have enormous power, natural resources, gold reserves, landmass, population, military. And again, I could go down the list, but this is a bloc that is as powerful in its own way by a lot of these metrics as the collective West, which I would call, US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others. So that's who this group is. Now there are a couple other groups that may join forces with the BRICS. There's something called the Eurasian Economic Union. Everyone's like, what the heck is that? Well, that's the EEU was Putin's answer. This has been around for a long time. This goes back to the early 2000s. This was Putin's answer to the EU. He said, well, you got the EU, we got the EEU. Now it's Russia and some Central Asian republics, Belarus and Tajikistan. I'm not saying this is France, Germany, and Italy, but it is a group that have reduced tariffs and improved trade between themselves. And there's another powerful group called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO, led by China. And these are mostly Central Asian republics, including Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and some others.